All right. So, what is ethics? Ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of right and wrong. So, it's a theory or a set of practices that inform our, or it's a theory or set of standards that inform our moral practice. So, legality and ethics do not necessarily line up. So things that are legal are generally speaking ethical, and things that are illegal are generally speaking unethical, but they don't match up perfectly. There are things that are ethical that are illegal, and there are things that are legal that are unethical. So for instance, a good example of something that's unethical but legal would be police oversight being conducted by other police organizations. So in many cases, when the police do something wrong, they are investigated by another police organization. So even though that's the way the law works, it's very much not an ethical way to go about it. An example of ethical but illegal are certain forms of protests, like blocking different roadways and things like that. In some jurisdictions, that is considered illegal, but in my opinion, at least, it's a very ethical form of protest. Rioting might be another instance where it might fall in some sort of ethical gray area. So riots are illegal, but depending on the circumstances, maybe they're warranted or justified. If you're rioting because the Vancouver Canucks lost the Stanley Cup, that's very much an unethical excuse for a riot, in my opinion. But if the riot is due to or in response to police brutality, then even though that's an illegal activity, maybe circumstances have gotten to such a point that a riot is the only way to draw the public's attention to something like this. So again, ethics and legality don't match up perfectly. Ethics deals more with morality, and it's not so cut and dry as legal or illegal. In the sciences, specifically, especially in GIS, research often involves handling private, personal information about individuals and minority groups. So there's a need for participants to trust that their information is going to be used in a safe and respected manner. So in the sciences, ethics they're usually managed by university research ethics statements to guide research approaches. There's university or regional research ethics boards. So these approve research before it begins. So it has to go through a couple different sets of eyes to make sure it's ethical before the research can start. There's the peer review process of both research projects prior to approval of funding, and then when they're submitted to a journal, they get peer reviewed again. And then again, there's state, national, and international laws, which to a certain degree govern ethics in the sciences. But as I mentioned, ethics and legality don't necessarily match up. And so specifically with regards to GIS, in many ways, GIS has the potential to be more intrusive into people's everyday lives than many of the other sciences. So we can know where people are at any given time, and with that information, you can generally guess reasonably well what they might be doing. We can know where people shop, approximately how much money they make, who they know, to which organizations they belong, whether they're a member of a certain minority group. And so how do we handle this information? That's a really important question, right? So there's some questions that might need racial demographic information in order to be answered. But how do you handle the dissemination of that information once the research has been conducted, for instance? One of the big concerns with ethics in GIS is data privacy and security. So, for instance, point locations risk the exposure or exposing personal information. So many agencies have guidelines surrounding releasing health information, for instance. So, for instance, the example we worked with in Lab 1 looks at the locations of cholera deaths in London. And so this happened in the 1860s, so it's not so relevant now that we can't release the point locations. But if we're working with COVID data, is it morally acceptable to release the point locations of all the different COVID deaths? Down to the detail of the specific household, I'd say it's probably not a good idea to release that information. You can stigmatize certain households or individuals or groups if you release information that's too finely detailed. On the flip side of that, more detailed information gives more accurate representations. It allows for better decision making and allows for more transparency. So not releasing any information at all is also quite problematic. And so where is that line? How do we decide it? Who gets to decide it? These are really big, important questions that are well beyond something that one individual researcher can answer. But for instance, an example fairly recently, the province of British Columbia doesn't do a particularly great job of releasing, say, demographic information regarding the distribution of COVID cases. And so their justification for sort of masking and not releasing a lot of data is this privacy and security concern, which to an extent is a valid concern. But at the same time, they've hidden behind not releasing demographic information in order to avoid answering certain questions, avoid making certain decisions and things like that. So for instance, you can see this map from January to February, or January 2020 to February 2021 of cumulative case rates per administrative division in British Columbia. But for instance, you look at this map, you see that they aren't really doing a great job of like looking at the detail of the information, releasing specifics. For instance, you see Vancouver is subdivided into 4 or 5 different regions, but then Surrey, they just show as one full block. And you look at the information regarding the age groups that get COVID that they released, right? They group it into 10-year demographics, and then Horgan goes on TV and says that the third wave is all the fault of younger people. But they're not releasing more important demographic information. So for instance, what fraction of these cases come from workplaces versus what fraction were, acquired through social interactions and things like that. That's a more important question to answer than just 20 to 29-year-olds are responsible for most of the COVID cases, right? These are also perhaps the individuals who are in forward-facing service worker jobs. And so there's much more detail and demographic information that could be released here that the province is refusing to do, and then using that to sort of hide behind when they get questioned for some of the policy decisions they make. As far as the spatial information, if they subdivided and release this information in more detail, maybe they could show some spatial trends regarding COVID cases within Surrey and use that information to guide their distribution and allocation of resources. And so more recently, the province has decided to start targeting hotspots with vaccinations, but that's probably something they should have done a long time ago. So, for instance, the city of Toronto does a better job of mapping out their COVID information. And so more information is usually better. We should not be releasing personal data, but in aggregate, finer resolution data can allow us to better understand complex issues so we can develop strategies to protect people. So the city of Toronto, for instance, collects at the neighborhood level COVID case rates. And you can, for instance, match that up with income data and pretty well show that some of the poorest neighborhoods are also some of the most negatively impacted by COVID. And so the finer resolution detail of this data allows us to see this. If we just had COVID case totals and median income for the full city of Toronto, that would be meaningless. And so, for instance, BC is just releasing case totals for the city of Surrey rather than looking at it on a neighborhood level. And you can't see how COVID cases break down by various demographic descriptors. So GIS has the potential to alter the political and economic environments that people live in. So this is a really important issue, right? Where boundaries are drawn can impact what schools a child attends, what property taxes people pay, what rights people have, what political system they live in, who wins an election, what economic opportunities are available, and so many more things, right? And so in many cases, these lines we draw are somewhat arbitrary. And so it really brings up some of the key ethical concerns in that these arbitrary decisions can have very drastic impacts. For instance, I mentioned back in week 1 and talked again a little bit about it on Thursday. Cartography is in many ways, or historically has in many ways, been used as a tool of oppression. So in the past, mapping has done a lot of harm. In the Canadian context, examples include the numbered treaties, where mapping and cartography by the federal government were used to gain a disproportionate advantage in these negotiations and pressure First Nations peoples into signing negotiation treaties that they weren't necessarily set up or prepared or didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Or in the westward expansion of the Canadian Railroad, for instance. Again, the geologic survey information was used to identify the most valuable routes and take up all of that land. And again, these are just arbitrary lines that are drawn on a map by people in Ottawa that are having impacts on First Nations groups in the prairies who have never seen, heard, or talked about any of this. An example in the context of the United States specifically is redlining. And so I'm going to assign a Vox video for you all to watch that's about 20 minutes long, talks about redlining. And then I'm going to have you just write a brief little summary on what redlining is and what it means. This is a procedure where banks and the federal government essentially drew lines on a map denoting neighborhoods that were or weren't acceptable, and then basically restricted who was allowed to get a loan within these neighborhoods. And so this is a process to a certain extent has also occurred in Canada, and there's also a variety of other problematic and nefarious things regarding housing and property rights that have happened in Canada. But redlining in the US is a very well documented example that gives a really concrete sort of overview of how cartography and lines and boundaries can have drastic, long-lasting impacts on people's well-being. So that's why I'm assigning this more US-centric video for this lecture, just because it's really well documented and covered, but things like this also happen in Canada. They're just generally speaking not as widely covered or talked about. So beyond just the historical background, the context to how it's intentionally been used to cause harm in the past, GIS and data science are continuing to cause harm. So technologies are still doing harm, whether or not that's necessarily intentional. Intention only means so much. It's really the end result, the impact that matters. So here's just a couple examples. One small example that's very much not an issue of malice, but just complete lack of thought or oversight would be, for instance, Apple's speech autocorrect suggestions. If you at least historically, I think they've since fixed this issue. It used to be if you typed in "she's the CEO," the word CEO will auto-suggest a male emoji, even regardless of the context of the sentence. And so I don't think the engineers at Apple intended for that to happen, but they just didn't think about it. And the AI system just kind of by default did that based on the data it was presented. A much more problematic example comes from Wisconsin, where a neural network or an artificial intelligence was used to predict the likelihood of someone reoffending, of a prisoner reoffending, and it was used to guide sentencing. And the system picked up on the racial bias in the sentencing historically in the data that was there, and ended up suggesting higher sentences for people of color than it did for white individuals. And again, this isn't something that was intentionally programmed into the system, but it's a byproduct of the fact that these networks are trained on data that already exists, and the data that already exists is racist. And you see this quote, the bottom left, the human-generated data is the biggest source of bias. So for example, in survey results, hiring patterns, criminal records, and other human behavior. So I'm assigning another Vox video. So I'm assigning you 2 videos from a series of 6 videos put out by Vox that are quite good. And this one is geared towards investigating how we can accidentally program racism into technology, and specifically dealing with machine learning and artificial intelligence, and how if you feed it racist data, you're going to get a racist result. And so I'm also going to have you watch this video and think through sort of the implications or ramifications of that, and write a paragraph or 2 about that as well. So looping back to the idea of cartography, no map can show the full picture. There's always going to be some error, some bias, some inaccuracy, right? As we show the world, which is a really complex space, simplified in 2 dimensions, every map is going to have something about it that is in some way, shape, or form an abstraction of reality. But some maps are much more misleading than others. So I've talked about this example a couple times, right? For instance, if you don't normalize your data, you end up painting a very different picture of the analysis that you've conducted. Now, relating to the ethics of GIS, this loops into a conversation I had last week regarding open source versus proprietary technology. So for instance, who has access to GIS, right? So this is just a look at the pricing for ArcGIS desktop, which is the, again, older, sort of less nice version of Pro, which is what you're working with. Pro is even more expensive. I don't want to guess how much it costs. But if you want, as an individual user, to buy a single license for basic ArcGIS with all of the extensions you need to actually do the analysis, it's going to cost you over $2,600 US. And this was from 2020, I believe. So probably even more expensive now. And so relying on these large software packages that are created by for-profit organizations is inherently problematic. It restricts who has access to GIS, who can and cannot conduct GIS. And so that's why I've tried to talk a little bit about open source technology thus far in the course, even though I've taught most things using ArcGIS Pro because that's what the department wants. You could just as easily do every lab that we've done in QGIS, for instance. So open source technology can help break down these barriers and help you work through some things. And so I actually have another part-time job where I work for the UBC library, and I run some workshops on open source GIS. And so I'll be running 2 workshops in August focusing on using Python to do geospatial analysis. So one is going to be going through some geocoding examples and web mapping, which will actually be, I adapted lab 4 from one of my workshops, so you get a more rounded look at that. And then another one is looking at specifically at how you can use Python to do some geospatial analysis. And so you might want to consider attending one of these workshops. I'll send out some information at the very end of term regarding when these workshops are scheduled.